They buried my wife Martha on a Tuesday morning in November, and by Thursday, my son Paul was already spending my money. I'm Frank Thompson, 70 years old, and what I'm about to tell you will show you exactly why sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones who share your blood. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Martha and I built Thompson Construction from nothing. Started in 1978 with a pickup truck, a toolbox, and enough determination to move mountains. 45 years later, we owned the most successful construction company in Arizona, worth $48 million. Every brick we laid, every foundation we poured, every skyscraper that touched the Phoenix skyline bore our sweat and dreams. Martha was more than my wife. She was my business partner, my best friend, and the smartest person I ever knew. When contractors tried to lowball us because they thought a woman couldn't understand construction, Martha would walk onto job sites in her hard hat and steel-toed boots and school them on structural engineering. She could read blueprints faster than most architects and negotiate contracts that left grown men speechless. The funeral was everything Martha would have wanted. Simple, dignified, attended by everyone whose lives we'd touched over nearly 5 decades in business. Martha always said she didn't want people crying over her casket. She wanted them remembering the buildings we'd created together, the jobs we'd provided, the community we'd helped build from desert sand into a thriving city. I stood in the receiving line at Sunset Memorial Chapel, accepting condolences with the composure of someone who'd been preparing for this day since Martha's cancer diagnosis 18 months earlier. At 70, you learn that grief doesn't make you weak if you don't let it. Sometimes, it can make you dangerous. Our son Paul stood near the back of the chapel, with his wife Jessica, both dressed in expensive black that I'd probably paid for indirectly. Paul was 38, handsome like his mother, but somewhere along the way he'd developed the entitled attitude of someone who'd never built anything with his own hands. Jessica was blonde, sharp-eyed, and calculating in the way that some people mistake for intelligence. During the service, while Pastor Williams spoke about Martha's legacy of hard work and generosity, I caught Paul checking his phone. Jessica kept glancing at her watch, like she had somewhere more important to be. They thought I couldn't see them, but I caught every whispered conversation, every impatient gesture, after the burial mourners gathered at our house for the reception. Our house. The sprawling ranch-style home Martha and I had designed ourselves with its exposed beam ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Sonoran Desert. Every room told the story of our life together. The kitchen where Martha had perfected her famous chili recipe. The office where we'd planned every business expansion. The workshop where I still built furniture by hand on weekends. I was in the kitchen directing the catering staff when I overheard Paul's voice from the adjacent hallway. He was speaking to someone, probably Jessica, in the confident tone he used when he thought he was being clever. "The old man won't last much longer without Mom," Paul said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "He's already showing signs of confusion. Pretty soon we'll need to step in and handle his affairs, all 48 million of it." I stood frozen, holding a coffee cup that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. My own son was discussing my mental capacity and my money while his mother's body was still warm in the ground. "We need to move fast," came Jessica's reply, her voice dripping with the kind of ambition that made my blood run cold. "Before he makes any stupid decisions or starts giving money to charity. Old people do crazy things when they're grieving." I set the cup down carefully, my hands steady despite the fury building in my chest. For 5 years, ever since Paul married Jessica, I'd watched my son transform from the loving child Martha and I had raised into this cold, calculating stranger. I'd seen Jessica's influence poison his heart, turning him against the values we'd tried to instill in him. But hearing them discuss my fortune and my supposed mental decline while mourners still filled my home, that was the moment I decided Paul needed a lesson about underestimation, respect, and the difference between earning something and expecting it to be handed to you. I walked back into the reception with my head high and my expression composed. I accepted more condolences, shared more memories of Martha, played the part of the grieving but dignified widower. But inside, something had crystallized into diamond-hard resolve. Martha used to say that the most dangerous opponent was the one who smiled while they planned your destruction. She'd taught me everything about reading people, about strategic patience, about the art of letting someone hang themselves with their own rope. My son was about to learn that his father had been an excellent student. If Paul wanted to treat me like a confused old fool who needed his guidance, I would give him exactly what he expected. For 1 week, I would play the helpless widower while Paul revealed his true character completely. And then Martha's final gift to our family would teach our son a lesson he'd never forget. The game had begun, and Paul had no idea he was already losing. The morning after the funeral, I woke up in the master bedroom Martha and I had shared for 42 years and felt the crushing weight of silence. No gentle snoring from her side of the bed, no rustle of newspaper from the sitting area where she always took her first cup of coffee, no quiet humming from the shower as she prepared for another day of building our empire. But instead of surrendering to grief, I found myself thinking about Paul's words. All 48 million of it. Where had I gone wrong? When had my loving, curious little boy become this cold stranger who discussed his inheritance while his mother's body was still warm? I knew exactly when. The day he married Jessica 4 years ago. Paul had always been ambitious. That was the Thompson way. Martha and I had instilled in him the importance of hard work, education, and building something meaningful. Paul had earned his business degree, worked his way up through different departments at Thompson Construction, and seemed genuinely committed to learning the trade from the ground up. Then came Jessica. She was beautiful, I'll give her that. 5'8" with honey blonde hair, sharp green eyes, and the kind of polished style that turned heads at charity galas and business dinners. When Paul first brought her home 5 years ago, Martha and I tried to welcome her warmly. She was intelligent, well-educated, from a respectable Scottsdale family. On the surface, she seemed perfect for our son. But there were signs. The way she calculated the value of everything in our home with her eyes. The questions she asked about the business, always framed as innocent curiosity, but probing for specific financial details. The subtle way she began isolating Paul from his old friends, his college relationships, even some family connections. Dad, Jessica thinks we spend too much time talking about the past, Paul had said during one of our weekly dinners, about 2 years into their relationship. She says I need to focus on building my own legacy instead of living in yours. The wedding had been beautiful, a $200,000 affair that Martha and I had paid for without complaint. Jessica had insisted on the most expensive venue, the most elaborate flowers, the most exclusive catering. Every detail was perfect, and every detail was someone else's money. After the wedding, the changes in Paul became more pronounced. The weekly family dinners became monthly, then sporadic. The phone calls shortened from long conversations about his dreams to brief perfunctory check-ins. When Jessica quit her marketing job 6 months after the wedding, claiming she wanted to focus on supporting Paul's career, I should have seen it as the red flag it was. The real turning point had come 8 months ago when Martha was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic with proper treatment. She could have had several more months, maybe even a year. But the diagnosis had triggered something ugly in Paul and Jessica. They'd begun hovering, asking pointed questions about estate planning, suggesting that Martha and I should simplify our affairs to make things easier for me when the time came. Jessica had even offered to help me understand the financial side of things, since I'd never had to deal with business matters alone. The condescension had been breathtaking. I'd been Martha's partner in every sense of the word, involved in every major business decision, sitting on the board of directors, using my construction expertise to guide our expansion into commercial development. But in Jessica's narrative, I was just the muscle who needed protection from the complexities of the business world. My phone rang, interrupting my dark thoughts. Charles Morrison's name appeared on the screen. Charles had been our family attorney for over 20 years, a sharp-minded man in his 60s who'd helped us navigate every major business decision and legal challenge. Charles, good morning. Frank, I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to see if we could move our meeting to this afternoon instead of next Tuesday. There are some time-sensitive matters we should discuss. Of course. Is everything all right? Everything's fine, but Martha left some very specific instructions about the timing of certain revelations. Can you come to my office around 2? I'll be there. After I hung up, I found myself wondering what kind of specific instructions my wife had left. Martha had always been meticulous about planning thinking several moves ahead in business and in life. Had she somehow anticipated the greed I'd witnessed in Paul and Jessica? I spent the morning going through Martha's personal effects. Her clothes, her jewelry, the small mementos she'd kept from her childhood and early business days. In her nightstand drawer, I found a sealed envelope with my name written in her careful handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 6 weeks before her death. My dearest Frank, if you're reading this, then my worst fears about my health have come to pass. I'm sorry I couldn't give us more time together. Every day with you has been a gift I never deserved. But I need you to know that I've been watching Paul carefully over the past 2 years, and I'm deeply concerned about the man he's becoming. The son we raised with such love and hope has been replaced by someone I barely recognize. Whether this is entirely Jessica's influence or something that was always lurking beneath the surface, I can't say. But I can't ignore what I see. I've made arrangements to protect you and to teach Paul a lesson about entitlement versus earning. Charles has all the details. Trust him completely. He's been working on this with me for months. You are stronger than you know, more capable than Paul gives you credit for, and more deserving of respect than either he or Jessica have shown you. Don't let grief make you forget your worth. I love you today, tomorrow, and always. Martha. I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring my vision. Even facing her own mortality, Martha had been thinking about protecting me, about ensuring that I wouldn't be left vulnerable to our son's greed. Whatever arrangements she'd made, whatever lessons she'd planned for Paul, I knew they would be both elegant and devastating. Martha never struck in anger. She struck with precision, patience, and perfect timing. As I prepared for my meeting with Charles, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day Martha died. Anticipation. My wife had left me one final gift, and I couldn't wait to unwrap it. Paul and Jessica thought they were in charge now. They had no idea what was coming. The trap was set, and they were about to walk right into it. Charles Morrison's law office occupied the top 2 floors of downtown Phoenix's most prestigious building. I'd been there countless times over the years for various business matters, but walking through those mahogany-paneled hallways on this particular afternoon felt different. Everything looked the same. The oil paintings of distinguished former partners, the Persian rugs, the leather-bound legal volumes. But I was different. Yesterday I'd been a husband. Today I was a widower with secrets to uncover. Charles greeted me personally, something he'd always done but which now felt especially significant. At 65, he moved with the careful dignity of a man who'd spent decades handling other people's most important decisions. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit immaculate, his handshake firm and reassuring. Frank, thank you for coming so quickly. Please let's go to my private office. He led me past the reception area to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city Martha and I had helped shape. The walls were lined with photographs of Charles with various clients and dignitaries, including several of him, and Martha at groundbreaking ceremonies and charity events spanning over 2 decades. Would you care for coffee? Coffee would be great, thank you. As Charles prepared our drinks from an expensive machine, I studied his expression. There was something almost excited in his demeanor, like a man who'd been keeping a delicious secret and was finally allowed to share it. Charles, I said, as he handed me a perfect cup of coffee. Martha's letter mentioned that she'd been working with you on some arrangements. What exactly did my wife plan? Charles settled behind his massive oak desk and pulled out a thick folder marked with Martha's name. Frank, what I'm about to tell you must remain absolutely confidential until the official will reading next week. Martha was very specific about the timing. Of course. Your wife came to me 10 months ago with some concerns about Paul's behavior. She'd noticed changes. The way Paul talked about money, his expectations about inheritance, his attitude toward you. Martha was particularly troubled by Jessica's influence and what she saw as Paul's growing entitlement. I nodded, remembering the subtle shifts I'd witnessed myself. Martha asked me to help her create what we called a teaching moment. She wanted to ensure that Paul learned the difference between earning something and expecting it to be handed to him. Charles opened the folder and pulled out several documents. The will that Paul believes exists, the one Martha discussed with him during their business meetings about succession planning, was never Martha's actual final will. My coffee cup paused halfway to my lips. What do you mean? The document Paul has heard referenced, the one that would have made him the primary heir to Thompson Construction, was essentially a draft that Martha allowed Paul to believe was final. Martha's actual will, the one that will be read next week, is quite different. How different? Charles smiled, and for the first time since Martha's death, I felt a flutter of genuine anticipation. Paul will inherit exactly $1 along with a letter explaining why. The bulk of Martha's estate, her share of the $48 million, the companies, the properties, everything goes to you with full discretion over Paul's future involvement. I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands. Charles, that's incredible. But Paul is her son. Surely Martha wouldn't completely disinherit him. Martha was very clear about her reasoning. She said that Paul had demonstrated over the past 2 years that he valued wealth over family inheritance over achievement. Martha wanted to give him the opportunity to prove himself worthy of the family legacy through his own efforts, not through birthright. Charles pulled out another folder, this one even thicker. Martha kept detailed records. Paul's comments about expecting his inheritance, his suggestions that you should retire and hand over control, his lack of respect for your contributions to the business. Martha even made some recordings. Martha began using a small recording device during family dinners and business meetings after her diagnosis. She captured Paul saying some illuminating things about his plans for the estate and his assumptions about your role in managing it. I felt a mixture of sadness and vindication. My wife had seen the same troubling changes in our son that I had, but she'd been methodical about documenting them. There's more, Charles continued. Martha also arranged for the transfer of several key assets into accounts that will be completely under your control. The house, the vacation cabin, the boat, they're all legally yours as of yesterday. But how Paul and Jessica will know something's wrong when they realize they can't access anything. That's the beauty of Martha's plan. For the next week until the will reading, everything appears normal. The accounts are still accessible for routine matters. The properties are still in the family name. Paul and Jessica won't realize anything fundamental has changed until I read the will publicly. Charles leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying this part. Martha predicted that Paul would likely begin making plans and possibly even financial commitments immediately after the funeral, assuming he had access to unlimited resources. Every assumption he makes now, every plan he develops based on wealth he'll never inherit, will make the lesson more definitive. That's brilliant. That's Martha. She always said the best business lessons were learned through consequences, not lectures. I thought about my son's arrogance, his casual dismissal of my competence, his wife's entitled attitude. The idea of them making grand plans based on wealth they would never inherit filled me with a satisfaction I probably shouldn't have felt. What happens after the will reading? That depends on how Paul and Jessica react. If they accept the situation gracefully and Paul demonstrates genuine remorse for his behavior, you'll have complete discretion about how much support to provide. If they fight it, Charles shrugged. Well, Martha made sure you'd have the resources and documentation to defend yourself. Thompson Construction becomes mine completely. Martha restructured everything over the past 6 months. You're now the majority owner of a company worth approximately $30 million, with full authority to make decisions about management and succession. The implications were staggering. Not only would I inherit everything, but I would have complete control over Paul's professional future. If he wanted to continue working for Thompson Construction, he would have to answer to me. Charles, this is overwhelming. I never expected Martha to be this thorough. Martha knew you'd feel that way. Charles handed me a second envelope sealed with red wax and marked, "For Frank's eyes only after the revelation." She left you another letter to be opened only after you'd learned about the will. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling slightly. My darling husband, by now Charles has explained the arrangements I've made. I know this feels like an enormous responsibility, and I know you're probably feeling conflicted about Paul's inheritance. Don't. You've earned every dollar of this fortune through your support, your expertise, your unwavering dedication to our family and our business. You've been my partner in every meaningful sense, and you deserve to control what we built together. As for Paul, I'm not punishing him out of spite. I'm giving him the greatest gift I can. The opportunity to prove he's worthy of the Thompson name through his own efforts rather than his birthright. If he's truly the man we raised him to be, he'll understand eventually. If he's not well, then we'll know who he really is. You are capable, intelligent, and stronger than our son gives you credit for. Trust yourself. Make decisions based on what's right, not what's easy. Use this opportunity to build the life you want free from the expectations of others. Forever yours, Martha. I folded the letter carefully, feeling a complex mixture of grief, gratitude, and determination. Martha had not only protected me financially, she'd given me the tools to protect myself from our son's greed and entitlement. There's one more thing, Charles said quietly. Martha asked me to suggest that you might want to observe Paul and Jessica's behavior over the next week before deciding how to handle the aftermath of the will reading. What do you mean? Let them think they've won. Watch how they treat you when they believe you're at their mercy. See what they do with what they think is their newfound power. Martha believed that people's true character emerges when they think they have nothing to lose and everything to gain. For a week, I would have to play the role of the confused, grieving widower, while Paul and Jessica revealed their true selves. But I would do it knowing that I held all the cards, that every moment of their arrogance was building toward their ultimate humiliation. "Will you do it?" Charles asked. I thought about Paul's words at the funeral. All 48 million of it. I thought about Jessica's declaration that old people do crazy things when they're grieving. I thought about years of subtle disrespect, condescension, and greed disguised as concern for my well-being. "Oh yes," I said, feeling a smile play at the corners of my mouth. "I'll do it. But Charles, when this is over, I want Paul to understand exactly how completely he underestimated his old man." "That," Charles said with obvious satisfaction, "is exactly what Martha hoped you'd say." The game was about to begin, and thanks to my brilliant wife, I was already several moves ahead. The morning after my meeting with Charles, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since Martha's death. Today marked the beginning of what I privately thought of as the observation period. 6 days of watching Paul and Jessica make increasingly presumptuous plans while I positioned myself as the confused widower who needed his son's wise guidance. But first I had some groundwork to lay. I called my neighbor Bob Martinez, knowing he'd be having his morning coffee and checking the local news. Bob had been our neighbor for 15 years and knew our family well. "Bob, it's Frank. I hope I'm not calling too early." "Never too early for you, Frank. How are you holding up?" "Some days are better than others. Actually, I was hoping I could ask your advice about something. It's about Paul and Jessica. They've been so wonderful offering to help me navigate Martha's business affairs, but I'm worried I might be leaning on them too heavily." Bob's voice immediately carried a note of caution. In our neighborhood, everyone had seen families torn apart by inheritance disputes. What kind of help are they offering? Financial guidance, mostly investment advice. They seem to have such innovative ideas about growing wealth, but I confess I don't understand half of what they're suggesting. Innovation can be wonderful, Frank, but it can also be risky. Martha was always so careful about investments. That's exactly what I keep thinking. But Paul seems so confident, and Jessica has such strong opinions about modern investment strategies. I don't want to seem old-fashioned or resistant to change. By the end of our conversation, I'd planted the seeds I needed. Word would spread through our community that Paul was pressuring his grieving father to make risky financial decisions without giving me time to process my loss or seek proper counsel. Around noon, Paul called with barely contained excitement. "Dad, great news! I spoke with that Miami real estate developer this morning. They're holding a premium unit for us, but we need to move quickly. The deposit is only $150,000, and they're offering special financing for the balance." My hand tightened on the phone. $150,000. That seems like a lot for a deposit. It's actually quite reasonable for a property of this caliber. And Dad, the projected returns are incredible. We're talking about a property that could be worth $2.5 million in 3 years. $150,000. Money that Paul didn't actually have access to yet, but he was speaking as if the transaction was already approved. "Are you sure this is wise, son?" "Absolutely. In fact, I'm so confident about this that I'm thinking we should go bigger. Remember that restaurant franchise I mentioned? I got a call back from their corporate office. They want to fast-track our application because they're impressed with our financial profile." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means they're offering us 2 locations instead of 1. The investment would be larger, $12 million total, but the revenue potential is enormous." $12 million. Paul was casually discussing an investment that represented a quarter of our entire net worth. $12 million sounds like a lot of money, Paul. "Dad, you have to stop thinking small. With our wealth, $12 million is a significant but manageable investment. And the franchise potential is incredible. We're talking about building a regional empire. Our empire, not his investment, but ours." Paul was already thinking of himself as the family patriarch, making decisions that would affect our entire financial future. "I suppose if you're certain." "I am certain. In fact, Jessica and I are meeting with their corporate team tomorrow to sign the preliminary agreements. They want to move quickly because they have other investors interested." "Tomorrow? That seems very fast." "That's how these opportunities work, Dad. You have to be decisive. Mom understood that. It's how you two built your fortune. Quick decisions, calculated risks, aggressive growth strategies." The irony was breathtaking. Martha and I had built our fortune through careful planning, conservative expansion, and methodical growth over decades. Paul was describing the exact opposite approach and attributing it to us. "Well, I trust your judgment, son. You've clearly thought this through carefully." "Exactly. And Dad, there's something else. Jessica and I have been talking, and we think it might be time for you to start thinking about simplifying your living situation." "Simplifying?" "The house is so big for just one person, and the maintenance costs must be enormous. We were thinking you might be happier in a nice assisted living community. Maybe something with activities and people your own age. Much more manageable for someone in your situation." Someone in my situation. A widower who needed his son's guidance because he was incapable of managing a large home or significant wealth on his own. I hadn't really thought about moving. "You don't have to decide anything right away, but the real estate market is hot right now, and the house would probably sell quickly for top dollar. The proceeds could fund some of our larger investment opportunities." The proceeds from selling my house, the home Martha and I had built together, would fund Paul's risky business ventures. He was already mentally liquidating my entire existence to finance his get-rich-quick schemes. "I'll think about it." "Take your time." But Jessica found this great realtor who specializes in luxury properties. She could come by next week just to give us an idea of the house's value. No commitment, just information. After Paul hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone. In the space of one conversation, my son had discussed spending $150,000 on a real estate deposit, committed to a $12 million restaurant franchise, and suggested that I sell my home to fund his entrepreneurial dreams. All of this while treating me like a confused old man who needed protection from complex financial decisions. I called Charles immediately. Charles, Paul just discussed spending $150,000 on a Miami real estate deposit and committing to a $12 million restaurant investment, all within the last 24 hours. Interesting. He's moving faster than Martha anticipated. Has he actually committed any money yet? He's making plans as if he already has access to the funds. He's scheduled meetings tomorrow to sign preliminary agreements. Frank, I need you to understand something. Paul can't actually access any estate funds until the will is probated and the inheritance is officially transferred. Every dollar he's planning to spend exists only in his imagination. Then how is he planning to cover these deposits and commitments? Either he's planning to use his personal funds, which are limited, or he's making promises based on money he expects to inherit but doesn't legally have yet. What happens if he signs agreements he can't honor? That depends on the specific contracts. But generally speaking, if someone commits to investments they can't fund, they could face breach of contract lawsuits, damage to their credit, and potentially even fraud charges if they misrepresented their financial situation. The magnitude of Paul's potential mistake was staggering. He was so confident about his inheritance that he was making commitments that could destroy him financially if he was wrong. Charles, is there any possibility he could actually access estate funds before the will reading? None whatsoever. Martha was very specific about the timing. Until the will is officially read and probated, Paul has no legal claim to any estate assets. Every plan he's making is based on assumptions, not legal reality. As I hung up with Charles, I realized that Martha's trap was even more elegant than I'd initially understood. Paul wasn't just going to be disappointed about his inheritance. He was going to face potential criminal charges for making commitments based on money he would never receive. The next 6 days were going to be very interesting indeed. Friday morning arrived gray and overcast, with November clouds threatening rain. I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one Martha had helped me pick out for our 40th wedding anniversary dinner 2 years ago. I wanted to look dignified but slightly frail, like an old man still processing his grief and relying on others to guide him through complex legal matters. Charles's office building looked imposing under the threatening sky, its glass and steel facade reflecting the gray clouds. I arrived 15 minutes early and spent the time in my truck watching Paul and Jessica pull up in what appeared to be a brand new Lexus SUV. Apparently, they'd decided to upgrade their transportation in anticipation of their windfall. Paul looked excited, practically bouncing as he walked toward the building. He wore his best suit and carried himself with the confidence of a man about to claim his kingdom. Jessica was equally animated, her designer dress and perfectly styled hair suggesting someone preparing for a celebration rather than a legal proceeding. They had no idea what was waiting for them. I entered the building a few minutes after them, riding the elevator to Charles's floor, while rehearsing my role one final time. I needed to appear appropriately subdued, perhaps a little confused by legal terminology, grateful for my son's presence and support. The receptionist led me to Charles's main conference room, where Paul and Jessica were already seated at the polished mahogany table. Paul jumped up to embrace me as I entered. "Dad, how are you feeling? I know this must be emotional." "I'm managing, son. Thank you for being here. I don't know what I'd do without your support." Jessica offered me a sympathetic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're here for you, Frank. Whatever the will says, we'll figure everything out together." Charles entered with his associate, both men carrying leather portfolios that contained the documents that would change all our lives. Charles looked solemn and professional, giving no hint of the bombshell he was about to detonate. "Thank you all for coming," Charles began, settling at the head of the table. "Before we begin, I want to explain the process. I'll read the will in its entirety, then answer any questions you might have about its provisions. The document has been properly witnessed and notarized, and all legal requirements have been met." Paul nodded eagerly. "We understand. Please go ahead." Charles opened the leather portfolio and removed a thick document bound in blue legal backing. "This is the last will and testament of Martha Elizabeth Thompson, executed on August 15th of this year." August 15th, just 3 months before Martha's death. The timing wasn't lost on me. She'd finalized these arrangements after her cancer diagnosis, after watching Paul's behavior during her illness, after making her final assessment of our son's character. "I'll begin with the preliminary statements and then move to the specific bequests," Charles continued. "Martha's words as written, I, Martha Elizabeth Thompson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my final will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils." Paul leaned forward slightly, his attention completely focused on Charles's words. "First, I want to express my profound love for my husband, Frank, who has been my partner, my advisor, and my greatest treasure for 42 years. Everything I built with his support, his expertise, and his unwavering dedication to our family and our shared dreams." I felt tears prick my eyes at Martha's words, and I saw Paul nod slightly at what he probably interpreted as a touching but irrelevant sentiment before the real business began. "Second, I want to acknowledge my son Paul, who has shown me much about the difference between earning something and expecting it, between building a legacy and inheriting one." Paul's confident expression faltered slightly at the subtle edge in those words, but he maintained his composure. Charles continued reading the preliminary statements, then paused before moving to the heart of the document. "Now the specific bequests. To my beloved husband, Frank Thompson, I leave the entirety of my estate, including but not limited to all real property, all business interests, all investment accounts, all personal property, and all liquid assets." The words hung in the air, like a thunderclap. Paul's face went blank with confusion, and Jessica's mouth opened slightly in shock. "This includes full ownership of my share in Thompson Construction, all subsidiary companies, the family residence, all vacation properties, all vehicles, all art and collectibles, and all bank accounts, investment portfolios, and retirement funds." "Wait," Paul said, his voice tight with disbelief. "What about my inheritance? I mean, what's left for the next generation?" Charles looked up from the document. "I'm not finished reading, Paul. Please let me continue." Paul's hands were visibly shaking now as the reality began to sink in. "To my son, Paul Thompson, I leave the sum of $1 to be paid from petty cash." The silence that followed was deafening. Paul stared at Charles as if he'd spoken in a foreign language, while Jessica's face cycled through confusion, shock, and dawning horror. $1, Paul's voice cracked. "That's not possible. Mom promised me we discussed succession planning. She said the business would be mine." "There's more," Charles said quietly, and continued reading. "I make this bequest to Paul not out of cruelty, but out of love. For the past 2 years, I have watched my son demonstrate that he values inheritance over achievement, entitlement over effort, and wealth over wisdom." Paul shot to his feet. "This is insane. She can't have written this. Someone influenced her." "Dad, you had to have changed her mind somehow." "Paul," Charles said sharply, "sit down and let me finish reading your mother's words." Paul sank back into his chair, his face pale and his hands trembling. "I have seen him treat his father, my beloved partner, with disrespect and condescension, assuming that grief would make Frank vulnerable to manipulation. I leave Paul $1 as a reminder that love must be earned, respect must be demonstrated, and family loyalty is a two-way street." Jessica's perfectly composed facade finally cracked. "This is impossible. Frank, you have to contest this. Martha wasn't thinking clearly. The cancer treatments must have affected her judgment. Actually, Charles interrupted, pulling out another document. Martha underwent a complete psychological evaluation 1 week before signing this will. The results showed her to be of completely sound mind, fully aware of her decisions, and acting without any undue influence. He pulled out more documents. Furthermore, Martha specifically anticipated that this will might be contested. She prepared a detailed explanation of her reasoning, supported by documentation of Paul's behavior over the past 18 months. Paul found his voice again, though it came out as more of a croak. What kind of documentation? Charles's expression remained professionally neutral. Recordings of conversations where you discussed your inheritance expectations, copies of financial commitments you've made based on anticipated wealth, and testimony from multiple witnesses about your treatment of your father during Martha's illness and after her death. The blood drained from Paul's face as he realized the implications. Not only had he failed to inherit anything, but his mother had been documenting his greed and entitlement for months. "This can't be legal," Jessica said desperately. "There have to be laws about disinheriting children." "In Arizona, parents have complete discretion over their estate distribution," Charles replied calmly. "Martha's will is entirely legal and virtually uncontestable." I watched my son process the reality of his situation. In the space of 5 minutes, he'd gone from expecting to inherit $24 million to inheriting $1. But more than that, he was realizing that his mother had seen through his facade, completely had recognized his greed and entitlement, and had chosen to teach him a lesson that would define the rest of his life. "Dad." Paul turned to me, his voice desperate. "You can change this. You inherited everything. You can give me what Mom should have left me. You can fix this." The moment I'd been dreading and anticipating had arrived. Paul was looking at me with the expectation that I would rescue him from the consequences of his own behavior. That paternal love would override judgment and justice. I looked at my son, this man who had dismissed my competence, planned to liquidate my life to fund his schemes, committed fraud by misrepresenting his financial situation, and treated me like a confused old man who needed his guidance. I thought about Martha's letter about the choice between enabling and teaching, between mercy and justice. "Paul," I said quietly, "your mother's will reflects her assessment of your character and your recent behavior. I don't think I should override her judgment." "What?" Paul's voice was raw with disbelief. "Dad, I'm your son. I'm your only child. You can't seriously be considering leaving me with nothing." "You're not being left with nothing, son. You're being left with the opportunity to prove yourself worthy of respect through your own efforts rather than your birthright." Jessica leaned across the table, her mask of concern finally dropping to reveal the calculation beneath. "Frank, you need to think about this carefully. Paul is your family. Blood is thicker than water." "Jessica," I said with a calm I didn't entirely feel, "over the past week, you and Paul have made it very clear that you consider yourselves to be in charge of this family's wealth. You've planned how to spend this inheritance, how to grow it, how to use it to fund your dreams. You've treated me like an obstacle to your wealth rather than the man who helped build it." "That's not true." "It's completely true. You've dismissed my intelligence, questioned my judgment, and assumed that grief would make me malleable to your manipulation. You've even had Paul contact realtors about selling my home to fund his investment schemes." Paul's face went through a series of expressions as he realized how completely his behavior had been observed and documented. "Dad, if we said things that hurt you, we're sorry. We were just trying to help." "You were trying to help yourselves," I said firmly. "And now you can continue helping yourselves, but with your own resources instead of mine." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Jessica beginning to cry. Not the delicate tears of grief, but the harsh sobs of someone watching their dreams disintegrate in real time. "Charles," Paul said desperately, "there has to be something we can do. Some way to challenge this." "Paul, you can certainly hire an attorney and attempt to contest the will. But I should warn you that doing so will trigger the release of all the documentation your mother compiled about your behavior." The recordings, the financial records, the witness testimony, all of it will become part of the public record. The threat was clear. Paul could fight the will, but doing so would expose his greed, entitlement, and recent dishonesty to public scrutiny. "How long do I have to decide?" Paul asked. 30 days from today to file any contest. But Paul, there's something else you should know. Your mother was aware that you might make financial commitments in anticipation of your inheritance. All of your recent agreements, the Miami condo, the restaurant franchise, the warehouse property, all of those obligations remain your personal responsibility. Paul's face went ashen as the full scope of his situation became clear. Not only had he failed to inherit the money he'd been counting on, but he was personally liable for over $20 million in commitments he'd made based on wealth he would never receive. As I watched Paul and Jessica's dreams crumble in real time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete and total vindication. Martha's plan had worked perfectly. The next 4 weeks were a masterclass in the destruction of entitlement. I learned about Paul and Jessica's disintegration through my neighbor Bob Martinez and other community connections who kept me informed without my having to ask directly. Paul hadn't contacted me since the will reading, and I was content to let him stew in the consequences of his choices. The first public sign of their troubles came when their new Lexus was repossessed from the parking lot outside Jessica's yoga studio. According to Bob, who heard it from his wife Maria, Jessica had caused quite a scene screaming at the repo men that there had been a mistake, that she would have them arrested for theft. The poor girl seemed quite distraught, Maria had reported to Bob. She was crying and carrying on about how this was all a misunderstanding, how her family's lawyer would sort everything out. The second sign was the restaurant franchise deadline. Charles had kept me informed about Paul's increasingly desperate attempts to secure financing. He had approached every bank in Phoenix, offering personal guarantees he couldn't back up and making claims about his inheritance that were no longer true. When the first deadline passed without payment, the penalty clauses kicked in immediately. Paul was now liable for not just the $12 million investment, but an additional $2 million in fees and damages. $14 million for a man whose annual salary was $80,000. The franchise company has hired a collection agency, Charles informed me during one of our weekly updates. They're moving aggressively to recover their losses. Paul's credit rating has been destroyed, and they're preparing to garnish his wages. The Miami real estate deal was next to fall. Without the ability to secure financing for the $1.8 million commitment, Paul had to forfeit his deposits and face breach of contract penalties. Another $400,000 he didn't have. But the most devastating blow came when Thompson Construction terminated Paul's employment. I hadn't ordered his firing. In fact, I'd specifically told the management team that personnel decisions should be made based on performance and behavior, not family relationships. But Paul's financial crisis had begun affecting his work. He'd been taking calls from creditors during business hours using company resources to try to arrange personal financing, and had apparently made several inappropriate comments to clients about family disputes affecting the company's stability. When the human resources director called to inform me of Paul's termination, she was clearly uncomfortable delivering the news. "Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that this decision wasn't made lightly, but Paul's behavior over the past 3 weeks has been disruptive and unprofessional. He's been using company time to handle personal financial matters, and last week he told a potential client that Thompson Construction was experiencing ownership disputes that might affect our ability to deliver on contracts." "I see. We can't have employees spreading doubt about the company's stability, especially not employees in senior positions. I hope you understand." I did understand. Paul had been so consumed with his financial crisis that he'd sabotaged his own professional standing. In trying to solve his money problems, he'd destroyed the one source of income he actually had. The social consequences came next. Word of Paul's financial troubles had spread through our community with the speed that gossip always traveled among people who had known our family for years. But what surprised me was how little sympathy he was receiving. Honestly, Frank, Bob Martinez confided during one of our morning walks. Most people are saying Paul brought this on himself. Making investment commitments before actually inheriting anything shows terrible judgment. And that wife of his, added our other neighbor, retired teacher, Helen Rodriguez. She's been calling people trying to arrange loans based on Paul's temporary difficulties, as if anyone would lend money to someone facing bankruptcy. The final social humiliation came when Paul and Jessica were asked to leave their country club. They'd been dining in the club restaurant when the manager approached their table and quietly informed them that their membership had been suspended due to unpaid fees. Apparently, Jessica had made quite a scene. She'd claimed that her father-in-law was temporarily controlling the family finances and that payment would be forthcoming. But the manager had pointed out that their membership fees had been in arrears for 4 months, well before any inheritance issues. 4 months. Paul had stopped paying club fees even before Martha's death, so confident was he about his coming inheritance that he'd begun living beyond his means while his mother was still alive. The personal toll on Paul and Jessica's marriage became apparent when Jessica moved out of their apartment and filed for divorce. The official story was that she was visiting family during a difficult time, but the court documents told a different story. Charles had contacts in the legal community who kept him informed about high-profile divorce filings, and Jessica's case was making waves. She's claiming that Paul misrepresented his financial situation when they married, Charles informed me. Apparently, she's arguing that she was deceived about his inheritance prospects and therefore shouldn't be liable for debts incurred based on false expectations. Can she do that? She can try, but since they were married when Paul made most of these commitments, and since she was an active participant in the spending decisions, she's likely to be considered equally liable for the consequences. 6 weeks after the will reading, Paul appeared at my door, looking like a broken man. He'd lost weight, his clothes were wrinkled and ill-fitting, and he had the hollow-eyed appearance of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. "Dad," he said when I opened the door, "can we talk?" I invited him in, noting how he looked around the house with the expression of someone seeing it for the first time, or perhaps for the last time. "You look tired, son. Are you eating enough?" "Not really. I can't afford groceries and I lost my job 3 weeks ago." "I heard. I'm sorry." Paul settled heavily on the living room sofa where he'd spent countless hours as a child watching cartoons and doing homework. Now he looked like a stranger in a familiar place. "Dad, I'm here to apologize. This was unexpected." "For what?" "For everything. For treating you like you were incompetent. For dismissing your intelligence. For lying to investors about having $48 million. For trying to arrange the sale of your house without your permission. For letting Jessica disrespect you and Mom's memory." His voice cracked slightly. "For being so greedy and entitled that I forgot what family actually means." I studied my son's face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. But what I saw was genuine exhaustion, defeat, and what might have been the beginning of actual wisdom. What brought this on? Losing everything. My job, my wife, my home, my future. Realizing that I destroyed my entire life because I thought I deserved something I hadn't earned. Paul looked around the room again, his gaze lingering on family photographs that showed him at various stages of his childhood. "I keep thinking about what Mom used to tell me when I was little. That respect is earned, not given. That work builds character. That family loyalty means putting love above selfishness." Do you remember those lessons? I remember them. I just forgot how to live them. We sat in silence for several minutes while Paul gathered his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but steady. "Dad, I need you to know that I'm not here to ask for money." "You're not." "No, I made my choices and I need to live with the consequences. But I am here to ask for something that might be even harder to give." "What's that?" "Forgiveness, and maybe the chance to earn back your respect." I felt tears prick my eyes at the vulnerability in his voice. This was the son I remembered, the child who had been capable of genuine remorse and growth. Paul, you've always had my love, but you're right. Respect has to be earned. I know, and I know I have a lot of work to do. For the first time in years, I was looking at the man Martha and I had tried to raise. Broken, humbled, but finally capable of genuine self-reflection. The question was whether this transformation was real or just another performance designed to manipulate his way back into my good graces. Time would tell. I didn't hear from Paul for 3 months after that conversation. Charles kept me updated through his legal network, and what I learned both surprised and encouraged me. Paul had indeed moved to Austin, Texas, where he was working for a small construction company owned by his college roommate Mike Rodriguez. He's starting at the bottom, Charles reported during one of our monthly check-ins. General laborer, 40 hours a week at $15 an hour, living in a studio apartment that costs half his monthly salary. How's he handling it? According to Mike Rodriguez, who I spoke with personally, Paul is one of the hardest workers he's ever hired. Shows up early, stays late, never complains about the manual labor. Mike says he's never seen someone with Paul's education and background willing to dig ditches and carry lumber without an attitude. The bankruptcy had been finalized, wiping out Paul's debts, but destroying his credit for the next 7 years. Through it all, he'd worked steadily, lived within his extremely limited means, and began the slow process of rebuilding his life from nothing. There's something else, Charles continued. Paul has been making voluntary payments to some of the creditors who were harmed by his fraudulent financial representations. It's not legally required. The bankruptcy discharged those obligations, but he's apparently determined to make things right through his own efforts. This was the detail that gave me the most hope. Paul wasn't just surviving his consequences. He was taking responsibility for the harm he'd caused, even when the law no longer required it. 6 months later, the first letter arrived. It was brief, handwritten on cheap paper, and completely unexpected. Dear Dad, I know I have no right to contact you after everything I did, and I'm not writing to ask for anything. I just wanted you to know that I think about you and Mom every day, and that I'm finally beginning to understand the lessons you both tried to teach me. I've been working construction for 6 months now, and I've learned something you tried to tell me years ago. There's dignity in honest work that has nothing to do with how much money you make. The men I work with respect me because I pull my weight and show up every day, not because of who my family is or what I might inherit someday. I've also been paying back some of the people I hurt with my lies and greed. It will take me many more years to make things right, but I'm learning that integrity means taking responsibility for your mistakes, not just apologizing for them. I hope you're healthy and happy. You deserve every good thing life can offer, and I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that. Love, Paul. I read that letter dozens of times looking for signs of manipulation or hidden requests for assistance. But what I found was something I hadn't seen from Paul in years: genuine humility and what appeared to be hard-won wisdom. The letters continued arriving every few months, each one a small window into Paul's gradual transformation. He wrote about learning to live within his means, about the satisfaction of building things with his hands, about the relationships he'd formed with people who knew nothing about his past wealth or family connections. Working with my hands has taught me something you tried to tell me years ago, he wrote in one letter. Success isn't about how much money you have. It's about how much value you create for other people. The houses we build will shelter families for generations. That's worth more than any investment portfolio. Gradually, I began to see evidence of the man Martha and I had tried to raise. The entitled, arrogant heir had been stripped away by necessity and consequences, revealing someone who might actually be worthy of respect. The real test came 18 months after Paul had left Phoenix, when Charles called with unexpected news. Frank Paul has been promoted to crew supervisor at his construction company. He's now overseeing the building of affordable housing developments for low-income families. How is that possible? He's only been there 18 months. Apparently, he's shown exceptional leadership abilities and work ethic. His boss says Paul has a gift for managing complex projects and motivating teams. More importantly, he's known for his integrity, something that's rare in the construction industry. And financially, he's living modestly but comfortably. No debt beyond normal living expenses, a small savings account, and a reputation for honest dealing. He's also continued making voluntary payments to his former creditors, even though he's not legally required to do so. A year later, another letter arrived that made me reconsider everything I thought I knew about redemption. Dear Dad, I wanted to share some news with you. I've been promoted to project manager, and we're building housing developments for families who otherwise couldn't afford decent homes. It's the most meaningful work I've ever done. I know this might sound strange coming from someone who once thought success meant accumulating wealth, but I've never been happier or more fulfilled. I wake up every morning knowing that my work makes a real difference in people's lives. I've also finished paying back everyone I could find who was harmed by my dishonesty 3 years ago. It took every extra dollar I could earn, but I've learned that peace of mind is worth more than any luxury. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness or to request contact. I know I destroyed your trust and disappointed you and Mom terribly. But I wanted you to know that the lessons you tried to teach me weren't wasted. I'm finally becoming the man you wanted me to be. Love always, Paul. Reading that letter in my kitchen, I finally understood that Martha's plan had worked exactly as intended. The harsh lesson had stripped away Paul's entitlement and forced him to develop the character traits that wealth and privilege had prevented him from learning: discipline, humility, the ability to delay gratification, and respect for earned achievements rather than inherited privileges. Yesterday, Charles had called with news I'd been both hoping for and dreading. Paul would like to see you, not to ask for anything, Charles added quickly, but to apologize in person and to show you who he's become. He's coming to Phoenix next month for a construction industry conference, where he's been invited to speak about affordable housing development. What kind of speaking engagement? He's been selected as a presenter at the Southwest Conference on Sustainable Housing. Apparently, his projects in Austin have become models for other cities. He's gained quite a reputation as an innovative project manager who can deliver quality housing on limited budgets. Did you arrange this opportunity? No. Paul earned this recognition through his own work. The conference organizers sought him out based on his professional achievements. What do you think I should do? I think you should trust your instincts. You'll know within 5 minutes whether Paul's transformation is genuine or whether he's learned to be a more sophisticated manipulator. Now, standing in my workshop where I'd spent countless hours teaching a young Paul how to use tools and build things with his hands, I thought about that conversation and about the choice I faced. I could continue my peaceful life in Phoenix, free from family complications and the potential for disappointment. Or I could meet with my son and discover whether he had truly learned the lessons that had cost him everything. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Paul's number appeared on the screen, the first time he'd called in 3 years. Hello, Paul? Dad. His voice was deeper than I remembered, calmer. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. Charles gave me your number. It's fine. I hear you're coming to Phoenix. Yes, for a conference. Dad, I know I have no right to ask, but would you be willing to see me? I understand if you don't want to, but I'd like the chance to apologize properly and to show you who I've become. I looked out at the desert landscape Martha and I had loved, at the life I'd built for myself through 3 years of independence and careful rebuilding. I'll be here next week, I said finally. We can meet for coffee. Thank you, Dad. I promise I won't ask for anything except the chance to prove that I've learned from my mistakes. After I hung up, I continued working on the rocking chair I was building for my new neighbor's first grandchild. In a week, I would discover whether Paul's transformation was real, or whether this was simply a more sophisticated version of the manipulation I'd endured years ago. But whatever I learned, I would make the decision from a position of strength rather than weakness, wisdom. rather than blind paternal love. Martha had given me the tools to teach Paul about consequences and character. Now Paul would have a chance to demonstrate whether the lesson had been learned. Either way, I would remain exactly what I'd become, Frank Thompson, a man who had learned the difference between love and enabling, between family loyalty and financial obligation, between helping and being used. The final test was coming, and this time I would be the one holding all the cards. 3 years later, I sat across from Paul at a small coffee shop in downtown Phoenix, watching my son with the eyes of a man who had learned the difference between hope and expectation. The man sitting across from me bore little resemblance to the entitled, arrogant heir who had stood in my living room 3 years ago demanding his inheritance. Paul looked older, certainly, but also somehow more substantial. His hands were calloused from real work, his clothes were clean but inexpensive, and when he spoke there was a gravity to his words that hadn't been there before. Dad, I want to start by saying that I don't expect anything from this conversation except the chance to apologize face to face and to show you who I've become. I studied his face, looking for the tells I'd learned to recognize over the years. The slight smirk when he thought he was being clever. The calculating look when he was working an angle. The barely concealed impatience when things weren't going his way. I saw none of those things. What I saw was a man who had been broken down to his foundation and rebuilt himself brick by brick through honest effort and genuine remorse. Tell me about your work, I said simply. Paul's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. We just completed a housing development for 30 families who were living in substandard conditions. Single mothers, elderly folks on fixed incomes, working families who couldn't afford decent housing anywhere else. Every family we house is a life we've changed. And financially, how are you managing? I make about $50,000 a year now. It's not much by Phoenix standards, but it's honest money that I've earned. I live in a small apartment, drive a 10-year-old truck, and I've never been happier with my choices. We talked for 2 hours. Paul told me about his work, about the lessons he'd learned, about the process of rebuilding his life from nothing. He didn't ask for money. He didn't hint at reconciliation. He simply shared who he'd become and waited for my response. When we finally prepared to leave, Paul looked directly at me with clear, honest eyes. Dad, I know. I destroyed your trust and disappointed you and Mom in ways that can't be undone. But I want you to know that losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me. It taught me who I really am when I'm stripped of entitlement and forced to rely on my own character. I thought about Martha, about the wisdom of her final gift to our family, about the difference between punishment and consequence, between enabling and love. Paul, I said finally, your mother would be proud of the man you've become, and so am I. The tears in his eyes were genuine, and for the first time in years, so were mine. 6 months later, Paul moved back to Phoenix to manage Thompson Construction's new affordable housing division, not as an heir claiming his birthright, but as a qualified professional who had earned his position through competence and character. He works for me now, but he's also working for something larger. For the families we house, for the community we serve, and for the lesson that real worth comes from what you build, not what you inherit. Martha's plan had taken 3 years to reach full fruition, but it had accomplished exactly what she'd intended. It had destroyed the entitled child and forged a man worthy of respect. The lesson Martha taught us all was simple but profound. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone you love is letting them fail completely. Real character isn't built through comfort and inheritance. It's forged through consequences and the choice to rebuild with integrity. Frank Thompson learned that true family legacy isn't about money passed down, but values lived out. Sometimes love requires the courage to let someone you care about face the full weight of their choices, because that's the only way they can discover who they really are. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if this story resonated with you, and share it with anyone who needs to hear that respect is earned, not inherited.